Good morning or good afternoon. Peter Carson here from Envision IT, and welcome to our webinar on the SharePoint Framework Developer Preview. Let's start with a quick introduction on myself. As I mentioned, my name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Envision IT. I'm also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. My contact information is up on the slide, and we're going to be posting the slide deck up on our website, same event page that you came to from a registration point of view. And we're also recording the session, so if you have colleagues who haven't had a chance to be able to join us today, they want to be able to come in on demand later, that recording should be up by tomorrow. We'll send a follow-up note to everybody as well, so they've got the details and contacts for that. All right, so let's then do a quick agenda check of what we're going to go over today. So we've done introductions. We're going to do a very brief overview of Envision IT, and we're going to dive right into some background on SharePoint development. We'll kind of take a walk through the history of development in SharePoint, talk about a variety of different alternative app models, and then get into client-side development in SharePoint Framework specifically. I'm going to show you some customer examples. Obviously, Framework is still in preview on developer only, so the examples I'm showing you conceptually are client-side. They're just not baked into the SharePoint Framework just yet. But I'm actually going to do some live demo of building a SharePoint Framework example, and I'm going to provide lots of links as part of the deck as well. So if you want to fire this up in your own development tenant and get a sense of how it all works and hangs together, I'm more than free to go ahead and do that. We'll be taking questions through the session if you post them online. I won't get a chance to look at them as I'm going through. I've got a couple of staff on the line that may be able to answer that for us. But if not, we'll take some time at the end of the session to try and answer those. Any that we don't get to, we can certainly follow up with after the session as well. All right, so a brief background for those of you who aren't familiar with Envision IT. We're a Mississauga, Ontario, Canada-based company focused on SharePoint, and we have been for better part of about 10 years or now. We build public websites, intranet staff portals, or extranets around SharePoint, both from an on-premises point of view and from an Office 365 perspective. The SharePoint framework that we're going to be discussing today is initially targeted to Office 365, but I will talk about plans announced last week at Ignite around how that could be coming to on-premises and what sort of schedule we'll see for that. We also have a software product that we sell. We're actually doing a webinar on this next week, so if you're interested in extranets, which is a main area of focus for us, tune into our extranet user manager. There was also some pretty exciting news last week from an Azure business-to-business point of view in terms of what Microsoft is providing and how we're building on top of that. So next week's webinar is really our chance to circle back from the exciting news coming out of Ignite and what that means from an extranet perspective. Okay, so let's jump right into our topic. Let's start with a bit of a background from a SharePoint development point of view. And what I've done is I've lifted a few slides coming from the various different Ignite sessions last week on SharePoint development and specifically on the framework. And what I've done is at the end of the session I've included links to those slides as well. So if you didn't get a chance to attend Ignite in Atlanta, recordings and slide decks are available on the Ignite Center. You don't have to be a conference attendee to access those. They're publicly available for anybody. So that's a fantastic resource. There was a ton of content. In fact, it was tough, given often the choice of 3 or 4 different sessions that I'm interested in, which do I attend? Now I've got the challenge of carving out some time to go back to those ones that I didn't get a chance to do and dive deeper into that. Tuesday was a big day for SharePoint Framework at the Ignite conference last week, though, and they had 3 or 4 sessions specifically on that, along with a couple of others on Thursday as well. So this was a session, Bill Baer and, I'm sorry, drawing a blank on the other individual that co-presented this, and started with this history of web development in SharePoint. So if we go back to the SharePoint 2001, 2003 days, that's where the full trust solution started from. 2007, this idea of a partial trust, or you know it probably better as Sandbox Solutions, came in through 2010, and then in 2013 the app model was introduced. So there's been historically 3 different models for doing development. There's been a number of bake your own sort of models that we'll talk about as well, and then we're coming into the SharePoint framework, which is really the 4th iteration from Microsoft in terms of development approach. And they're not saying that you can't use the previous ones other than Sandbox. For the most part, Sandbox or partial trust solutions have been deprecated. It's just they're not all available in all environments, so that's just something to be aware of. And if we start back with a full trust solution, which is if you've done SharePoint development, probably where you've had most of your experience, The idea here is that the code runs on the SharePoint server and you have access to the full server API. That means that you can pretty much do anything. And that's great if you control the environment. It's not great if you're Microsoft and Office 365 and you've got thousands or millions of tenants all wanting to run their own custom code. I mean, it would just cripple the server. People would put bad code in there and it would be a huge impact. So they just flat out said, nope, we're not supporting full trust solutions on Office 365. Never have, never will. If you want to run your own code, you need to run it somewhere else. It also raises some challenges when upgrading SharePoint, not just when you're upgrading to Office 365. Obviously, you need to rewrite those because they're not going to function in Office 365, but even as you move, say, from 2007 to 2010 to 2013 to 2016 through the on-premise versions, sometimes that can be a challenge to getting these solution files properly packaged up and deployed into the newer versions and making sure that they work properly in those new versions. So there's certainly concerns even from an on-premise point of view in terms of working with full trust solutions. And as a SharePoint consultancy, we used to build lots of full trust solutions. I would say in the last 2 years or so, we've built almost none. I mean, we've really switched to a client code model that we'll talk about in a minute. Before we get there, though, I want to continue our evolution through the development history. Sandbox Solutions, or partial trust, as Microsoft called them in their slide. The idea here is that you are running code on the SharePoint server, but it's running in a restricted sandbox. So even if you do something wrong, it may affect your application, but there's boundaries around that, and it can't affect the server environment as a whole. So there's a certain safety net there in terms of not being able to bring down the environment as a whole and adversely affecting other tenants within the Office 365 environment. There are a limited set of API methods available there. It was supported both on premises and in Office 365, but it is now deprecated by Microsoft. They're recommending that you not continue to develop sandbox solutions. For some time there was what they called declarative-only sandbox solutions, which are typically used to deploy branding solutions. They didn't actually have any code in them. They just had an XML declaration that said these files need to go up here into the SharePoint farm. Mixed opinions as to whether you should even be using those. I mean, really, Microsoft is recommending, even in that situation, you script the deployment of those elements, either through PowerShell or through JavaScript. So next we got the apps model, and there was a couple different flavors of this. The first was the simpler called SharePoint hosted, and the idea here is that it's all client-side code. So it's all JavaScript. There's no code running back on the server, and you're using either the client-side object model or REST APIs to communicate back with SharePoint. Now, anything that this app is going to be doing, it's going to be doing in the context of the user who signed into SharePoint, so they need to have appropriate permissions for that. And that's not always appropriate, and we'll talk about how we get around those kinds of situations, because there's no ability to run with elevated permissions. You're running in browser in the context of the user that's signed in. The other model called provider hosted, here you've got your apps running in a separate server or separate IIS site from SharePoint. So we get the code off the SharePoint server, so that's great. It can be supported in Office 365. We could run that code in Azure if we want to do it all in the cloud. We could put it on an on-premises server. It doesn't really matter from that point of view. And the UI then runs in an iframe in the SharePoint window. So your app is really a completely separate and independent web application that's just running in an iframe inside of SharePoint. Now there's some advantages to the provider hosted app model around security and such that the user context can come through to that app. So you can do things within that context, or you can elevate permissions if you need to do something that the sign-in user isn't able to do themselves directly in SharePoint. So what are some of the challenges with the app model? If you haven't got the sense yet, I'll be completely transparent here. I'm not a fan of the app model. There's too much complication there for most of what the intent for custom apps are, in my opinion. Yes, there is the idea of I want to get my app into a store. I'm a commercial ISV like our Extranet User Manager product. It doesn't really make sense as a SharePoint app, but there's vendors like Quizcom, Bamboo that have all sorts of cool applications, and they've built those as apps that you can purchase and download and install in your app catalog. There's a lot of complexity around supporting that. You need to set up separate wildcard app domains, you need certificates, you need SSL certificates. Then there's a lot of complexity moving those through different environments. So if your goal is not to build a commercial application, but rather to build a bespoke custom application, you've got a specific business process for your organization, for your client that you want to build, really you're not interested in putting up in a store. You don't need all that complexity. these apps, as under this model, are really intended to be discovered and added to sites by end users. I find that a lot of the corporate development that we do in SharePoint, that's not the case. It's not that you're going to build, later I'll show you a leave request form. You don't want staff to be able to discover a leave request form and add it to their site. No, HR wants to control that. They want a single place where that application is going to live, and they want tight controls around how that gets deployed. So all this complexity to make it easy to discover and deploy really isn't needed in those sorts of situations. So I think I've talked ahead on one of my slides here. Really, it's intended for things that you're going to add multiple times to sites that end users can discover and deploy. But the reality, as I mentioned, those custom apps typically only need to exist in one or maybe a couple of places through there. So we don't need that complexity. So prior to SharePoint Framework, we'd already started going down this model and actually delivered a version of this talk that had a lot of this content in it without the SharePoint Framework over the last year or two to different conferences and clients that I've worked with. And what I did was I started with a checklist that I built of what's my ideal app model. And the first one is no iframes, please. I'm really not a fan of iframes. Basically, if you're not familiar with them, they're a window on your web page to another web page. And if you don't get that window right, you're going to have scroll bars around it. You have this weird user experience where you have scroll bars within scroll bars, and it just doesn't work well from that point of view. From a branding perspective, it's got its own completely independent CSS and styling and everything else. It's not well integrated in. So I'm really not a fan of using iframes. I would rather see the HTML for the user experience embedded right into the native page in SharePoint itself. All this complexity with wildcard DNS domains, just takes that off the plate. Particularly if you're going to be exposing these apps externally, in your firewalls and your publishing rules, it just adds a lot of complexity that I'm not interested in doing. Obviously, we need to stick with the Microsoft model that there can't be any code on the SharePoint server. I want an app model that I can write code the same way, whether I'm going to be using it from an on-premises implementation or from a cloud point of view. Even if a cloud client is committed to on-premises, who knows what's going to happen a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. SharePoint Online is just becoming more and more compelling for almost all organizations. So we want to build things that are forward-thinking, that okay, it is on premises today. We want to make sure the processes that we take, the approach we take, lends itself well to online as well and doesn't require any code to be running on the SharePoint server. Great user experience. I mean, that's part of why I hate iframes is they often don't provide a good user experience, but I want complete control around that user experience. I will be able to use Bootstrap, Knockout, Handlebars, all these cool open source technologies that are out there beyond SharePoint that allow you to build these really rich user experiences on your applications. On the same token, let's use a standard development model. Let's not build things in a very SharePoint-y way that only somebody who's familiar with the SharePoint development lifecycle can get their head around. I want any web developer, who understands HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, and can get into this and start building apps through here quite quickly. We do need to run with elevated permissions, and I'll talk about what that means and where those scenarios are. Sometimes the user who's running your app needs to get some information from SharePoint or from some other system that they directly don't have access to, and you want to have some business rules and some security around that. So we'll talk about how we do that. And on that token, we often need to integrate with more than just SharePoint. So how do we access other corporate systems, whether they're third-party SaaS applications or internal applications that have been developed by corporate IT. Okay, so let's switch gears now. That was kind of the prehistory and what I'm looking for from an app model independent of SharePoint Framework. SharePoint Framework was announced internally to us as MVPs coming up on about a year ago now. There was dev kitchens happening back in the spring, and then this past summer it actually became public. I guess it was first announced at the May 4th event, but we couldn't actually touch it and play with it. The developer previews went live late in August, and it's up there and available for anybody that wants to play with it. Basically what you need is an Office 365 developer tenant, which you can request and get a free version of for a year. You can request a new one after a year, you can pay for it, it's up to you, and start playing with the SharePoint framework. And again, I'm going to provide all the links and guidance if you want to do any of this stuff yourself. You'll be more than able to do this after this session. So this is, again, going back to the sessions last week at Ignite. I'm using the Microsoft slides here, and this is them asking, well, why did we need SharePoint Framework? Yet another thing. This is the fourth kick at a development model for SharePoint. What was the matter with the other three? You know, is there going to be another one just another year or two out from now? And really, you know, what they were doing was looking at the telemetry in SharePoint Online and trying to understand what were developers doing themselves. And the approach I'm going to show you with some of our applications that we already developed leverage a lot of the script editor web part or the content editor web part. And what they saw, Microsoft has great telemetry on who's doing what in SharePoint Online, is that by orders of magnitude, the most common web part in SharePoint Online was the script editor web part. What does that mean? It means that people are writing their own custom client-side code. They're not using the app model that was introduced in SharePoint 2013. They're just rolling their own, embedding in a script editor web part and putting it on pages from there. So, okay, obviously this is an approach that's working for people that are able to use standard open source techniques. Maybe we need to embrace this. So they said, okay, we're going to put a framework around that. And that's really the birth of the SharePoint framework. At the same time, you know, Microsoft was going through an exercise in how they want to kind of revamp and refresh the UI on SharePoint. You know, it had kind of, the ribbon had come in 2007, some of the web content management stuff had come in 2013, but really it hadn't had a major overhaul in terms of how it looked and feel in going on a decade. So that's a long time in the web world. You know, things like responsive design is just expected now. People, whether it's a corporate internal site or a public-facing site, you know, they want to use it on their smartphone. They want to use it on their tablet, not just their desktop. Iframes, love it or hate it. I think you're clear on where I stand. I'm not a fan of them. You know, they wanted to get away from that. So they started building out the SharePoint framework. And one of the things that they decided as an organization was, you know what, if we're going to be rebuilding the SharePoint user experience and we need a new framework to do that, and clearly the market needs a new framework, let's build that together. So the idea behind the SharePoint framework is it's not just for us outside of Microsoft to leverage, it's actually for what they call first-party development as opposed to third-party development. First-party development means I'm an engineer working inside Redmond at Microsoft on things like the modern library look or modern pages features that we're seeing coming out now in SharePoint Online. Those are actually built using the SharePoint framework. They said, you know what, we're going to eat our own dog food. It's a term you often hear from Microsoft. It maybe didn't happen as much within the internal SharePoint development engineering teams. And they said, okay, we're going to build this framework and we're going to use it ourselves, and all the warts and the pains that we experience as doing that, we're going to be incentivized to fix those, which will make it better not just for us, but for the third-party developers, us out in the community and in corporate IT and vendors to be able to benefit from that as well. So they said, okay, here's our principles around this. We want to do modern client-side development. We want to leverage not just JavaScript, HTML, CSS, but all the open source frameworks, jQuery, TypeScript, CSS tools, open source tools for building that we'll get into in terms of how I actually compile, debug, and deliver my packages as well. So they've really embraced the open source side of it. It needs to be really lightweight from a web and mobile point of view. You want things that are very snappy, very interactive, and that client-side development really helps do that. This comment about powers our own experience, that's about the first-party development, those engineers within the SharePoint teams themselves using these same tools to make those tools better. It does need to be backward compatible. You know, how do we bring it back into to other earlier versions? You know, and question that came up during the sessions was, well, when is this going to be available in what versions of SharePoint? And I think the answer was, we're going to see it on SharePoint 2016 for sure. Will we see it on 2013? Not so sure on that. From a timeline point of view, though, this is still in developer preview in SharePoint Online right now. It needs to get fully baked online. Microsoft's a cloud-first strategy from a development point of view, so that you're going to see it go to general availability in SharePoint Online first, and then it'll come out in a feature pack on SharePoint 2016 after that. So, I mean, we're not going to see that in this calendar year on premises, but, you know, I would hazard a guess, don't quote me because this is not official from Microsoft, that sometime in 2017 we're going to see it on SharePoint 2016. This idea of feature packs rather than, you know, major versions every 3 years is kind of the direction that they're going on premises, and we'll see it in a future version of that. And I already mentioned, you know, the open source tools and JavaScript web frameworks. Okay, so what is the scenarios that we're going to use SharePoint Framework in? Right now, it's focused on custom web parts. So whether that's vertical, internal, corporate applications, integrating in with other external systems, it's building those custom web parts that I can drop on pages. Whether those pages are the new modern pages or what Microsoft's calling the classic pages, the pages that we're used to, the same web parts will work on both of those. But ultimately, it's going to be used for enhancing out-of-the-box experience. One of the complaints that's been coming through loud and clear from myself and others is, well, how do we brand some of these modern experiences? The new modern libraries are cool. They've got great features from them, be able to interact with documents quickly and do things quickly. But I still want to have some of my corporate brand in there. How do I do that? SharePoint Framework, my understanding is ultimately it'll be leveraged to do those sorts of things, to provide that branding, building custom internet portals, some of the modern page development that we're seeing, big part of that as well. So stay tuned. It's not just for building custom web parts. It will grow beyond that in terms of other things that you do within SharePoint with that. Now, the first thing that you're going to have to get used to if you're going to start playing with the SharePoint framework and you do come from a SharePoint development background, there's a whole new set of tools that you need to get comfortable and used to. If you come from the external to Microsoft web development community and you're familiar with things like Node and Human and Gulp and TypeScript and such, you're going to be very comfortable here. But it is a transition for a traditional SharePoint developer. And I count myself into that world. I don't actually do a whole lot of development myself anymore. The team in Envision IT kind of likes if I stay out of the project so I don't make a mess of things. But I like to play around and keep current on what's going on in the technology. So I have to admit, this has been a learning curve for me to learn these new open source tools, and I've by no means learned them. There's still a lot more to go here, but at least get comfortable with them. So there's quite a number that I'm going to go through here. I'm going to start with the ones specific to the framework that are really key to Microsoft's strategy. And the first is Node.js. So it's a JavaScript runtime tool, and it's really where your code runs as you're developing. So it's a local instance on your development machine. You don't need a SharePoint VM with a whole version of SharePoint running to do development anymore. In fact, you don't even need SharePoint at all. You can do your core development outside of SharePoint completely. Node Package Manager is another component of that. Think of it like a GitHub if you're familiar with that, place to go to get open source libraries and pull that content down. Human is a scaffolding tool, so if you want to start a SharePoint framework project, rather than starting with an empty slate and saying, okay, what are all the files and how do I need to organize them and get them together, Human has templates for SharePoint frameworks. And I'll actually show you how we go through this to say I want to generate a SharePoint framework project. It creates all the files and wires it all together for you. So that's great because you can actually have a running Hello World project very quickly. There's quite a number of files that get provisioned for that. You don't need to worry about where they all go and making sure they're all wired up appropriately. Then you can dive in there and start to customize from there. I find that's a tremendous boost as a developer. Give me a very simple example to start with that I can work with, and then let me take it from there. Gulp is a cool tool that I have to admit I wasn't familiar with prior to starting to look at SharePoint Framework. It's basically a task runner from a build automation point of view. I mean, we're a big Microsoft shop. We've used Team Foundation Server for years, and we've got a number of build servers and automated build processes around many of our SharePoint projects, particularly the bigger ones. The downside of that is those build processes are very monolithic things. You check all your code into TFS, you run the build scripts, and it may take a couple of minutes, maybe it takes 10 or 15 minutes if it's a big project. At the end of the build script, it deploys all the pieces out to your dev integration, and then you can try it out. So you might have a 15-minute dev cycle turn through that to see the results of that. So you typically wouldn't use that for your interactive development. You would do it for your your final build process. From an interactive point of view, you just open up Visual Studio, build your stuff, and run it on your local VM from there. Gulp kind of takes that away because what it does, one of its cool features is some of the task runners can watch files and folders on your local file system. So I'll show you later, but you basically use Human, you build up this whole structure of a project on your local system, you run it through Node, and then Gulp watches that and updates the builds as you're doing your editing. So it becomes very interactive. I can go in and I'll show you, edit a couple of lines of code while my application is running and I've got it open in the browser. Gulp reruns the pieces that it needs to, and literally a couple seconds later I can refresh my page and see the results from that. So it makes it a very interactive process. TypeScript is an open source extension of JavaScript, originally created by Microsoft, but it's broadly open source now. And really, if you've come from a C# world and moved to JavaScript from a development perspective, you probably feel a little uncomfortable with JavaScript because it's not a strongly typed language. You can use variables before you define them. You can convert between different types very easily, even if you don't mean to. You may have code paths that don't even get executed, or syntax errors that you don't find until you actually run it at runtime. So it's not a strongly typed language. TypeScript addresses that. It says, okay, make my JavaScript more like a C#. Let me inherit properties and classes. Let me have strongly typed, full compile type checking of all my code. But the end result is it compiles it to plain old JavaScript. So it still runs on any browser. You don't need any plugins. It's fully open source, but it gives you a much stronger development environment to work in from a JavaScript point of view. And I have to admit, we haven't really adopted TypeScript yet. We're aware of it. We've tinkered with it, but we haven't made that full switch over to say all the JavaScript development we're going to do is in TypeScript. It's something I absolutely want to push forward within our own organization. I strongly recommend, if you do a lot of JavaScript work yourself, to do the same thing as well. And the cool thing is, when you bring Gulp into the equation, you can be editing your TypeScript code, and as soon as you save it, Gulp sees that, and it'll generate it into the new JavaScript, refresh your browser, see the change. It becomes still very quick and interactive from a development point of view. Some of the other frameworks I'll go through more quickly. React is a open source framework originally developed by Facebook for building UI. It's something that Microsoft decided on. They went through a lot of soul searching because they're trying to pick a framework. Do we use Knockout? Do we use Angular? Do we use React? There's a lot of different frameworks out there, and they spent months looking at them, and they think they decide on one, and then someone would say, well, what about this new one you didn't think about? Oh, let's look at it again. They said, you know what, we just need to draw a line in the sand. We like React. We can't have our engineering teams internally using a dozen different frameworks. All our internal developed work is going to be with React, but external developers, you're free to use whatever framework you want. So you don't have to use React. It's just what Microsoft uses internally. Bootstrap is a big part of responsive, making sure that your apps scale and respond well to different sized devices. Less is kind of like TypeScript. It's a CSS preprocessor, so you have a much richer language and inheritance and such that you can define in your CSS, just like you do in JavaScript with TypeScript. And again, it goes through a processor and compiles into standard CSS. jQuery, say no more. I mean, if you've been doing any client-side development, you'd have to be under a rock not to be aware of jQuery. Handlebars is something that we use a fair bit. It's a very simple templating engine. We don't need a full React or Angular type of framework, and I'll show you some examples around that. Knockout and Angular I've already mentioned. Visual Studio, we'll get into back-end code and web APIs and what makes sense from that point of view. Swagger, I'm very keen on. If you're building web APIs, it's a great tool for defining your API, providing your test benches from a unit testing point of view. And Swashbuckler is another open source package that basically wires Swagger into your Visual Studio project. So those three kind of all go together. All right. So let's come back to TypeScript, and let me take you through, again, another of the Microsoft Ignite slides of what the sequence is of doing development. And we'll go into more detail through these. I want to start with a high overview. So the first thing is install the SharePoint generator. So you need Node, you need Human, Gulp, a couple different parts installed in your development environment. You fire up Human and say, I'd like to use a template to build a SharePoint web part. And it basically spits out a whole whack of files on your local file system in a directory that you specify that you can use as your starting point. You then edit that web part, do whatever coding you want to do with that. It's got Visual Studio in here. I actually prefer using Visual Studio Code that I'll show you. It's an open source version of Visual Studio that lends itself really well to doing this kind of work. Gulp watches that, it compiles it, it puts it up in what's called the SharePoint Workbench, so you can play with it and see it, you can refresh it, and go through that iterative loop of edits. Gulp compiles, refresh browser, try it out, continue ad nauseum until you've got the app where you'd like it to be. And at this point here, you can be running the SharePoint Workbench locally outside of SharePoint. You can build mock stub endpoints to kind of imitate what SharePoint would give back if you need to interact. And then you can deploy it to another SharePoint Workbench in your SharePoint environment if you actually want that code to be able to actually interact with SharePoint. So you can work either way. You often start with one locally, and then you move to the SharePoint Workbench as you need to build more of that integration side of things. Gulp also does your packaging, so it actually creates your app package that you're going to upload into your app catalog. I'll show you how that works, and then you can start actually deploying that against your client side and your classic pages. When it's ready to ship, you need to deploy the assets out to a CDN. So the app catalog piece is just the app itself, all the supporting JavaScript files, CSS, everything else that you need. You need to deploy those separately from the app. And the recommended approach is to use a content delivery network to do that. And I'll also mention some interesting announcements around CDNs and Office 365 that came out last week. And you're ready to ship it. Okay. So these are kind of the steps that you follow through here. And what I'm pulling the information from is the first link there, that GitHub wiki article around SharePoint Framework. It's a great series of articles. I've got to open in my browser here. Let me just flip over to that. And it starts with an overview of the SharePoint Framework. And it literally walks you through all the steps of how do I set up my my developer tenant and developer environment, how do I build my first web part, connect it to SharePoint, put it on a classic SharePoint page, deploy to a CDN, add some UI experience to that, and even look at putting in some React components into that. So it's really a nice soup to nuts. Now I won't have time today to go through the whole process, but we're going to go through the first couple of parts of that to give you a sense of what that looks like. By all means, though, if you haven't looked at this already, go through that. Set up your own tenant, play around with it. It's cool from there. Okay, so I've already set up my Office 365 developer tenant. There's a couple of steps that we need to do there. Then we need to set up my local machine and then go build our first web part. So we'll actually go through some of those steps through there. So in terms of setting up your tenant, not your local machine, but your Office 365 developer tenant, just go ahead and sign up for it. Google Office 365 developer tenant, you'll find the site. Sign up. It'll take sort of 10 or 15 minutes to fully populate itself. Create an app catalog site. Now this third step is important. You have to create a developer site collection. So there's different site templates, obviously, in SharePoint. In the Office 365 developer tenant, there's a special one called the developer site collection. To use the SharePoint framework, you have to use that site collection as your target that you're going to be working with there. Set up a document library in there and upload the SharePoint Workbench, which is literally just a file that you get from the wiki site, upload it up into the Workbench, and that's your SharePoint Workbench that you use for your interactive development. So I've already done that on my tenant. I've got an Office 365 tenant here. So if I look here, I've actually got my Workbench. Oh, that's my local one. I've got my app, my site/developer, which is my developer site collection, and I've got my app catalog set up as well through here. So I've kind of pre-staged all that and got that ready for us, so we don't have to go through that as part of this session. But it didn't take me long, sort of, half an hour tops. You're up and running. You've got your tenant ready to go from that point of view. Now there's some things that you need to do on your local machine. I mentioned Node.js is basically the runtime environment that your apps are running in as you're working on your development. So you need to install Node.js. You also need to install UMIN and Gulp. So UMIN is the scaffolding engine that builds your project for you. And Gulp is the task runner that basically watches your project, looks for changes in it, compiles and deploys that out for you. So you actually use NPM, which is part of Node.js. It's the package manager to install both Gulp and the UMIN SharePoint generator components. So I've got those installed on my local machine. The next thing is, well, let's actually create a Hello World web part. So let me actually open up a new command window here. And let's go through that process. So make that a little bigger so it's easier to see. Except I can't see my notes, bear with me. So the first thing I need to do is make a directory where I want to keep this stuff. So I've got a development tree on my local C drive. I'm going to make I think I already had a demo 1 in there. I'll make a demo 2 directory. So I can just change into that directory. And I'll fire up UMIN, which is already in my path because it got installed, at Microsoft/SharePoint. So this is the scaffolding engine. Actually, I can make this bigger now. And if I spell it properly, it'll actually work a lot better. Let me try that again. Missing an O there. Apparently it's too small for me too. Okay. So Human starts up, one thing to note, a lot of the open source stuff is command line. I've kind of gotten used to GUI for everything, so it's taken me back to my early days of development where everything happened on the command line. It's kind of cool from that point of view. Okay, so it's fired up the SharePoint client-side solution generator and says, what's your solution name? It's inferring it from the directory that I'm running in, demo2, so I'll just hit enter to accept that. Where do you want to place your files? Go ahead and just create it in the current folder. And what web part do we want to create? We're just going to use the standard hello world that comes with it. A description for that. And here's where it asks about framework. So currently, there is built-in support for both React and Knockout from a framework within the UML generator. We'll probably see this extend to other frameworks like Angular and others as the product itself evolves. For now, I want to keep it simple. I'm not actually going to put in a framework at all. I'm just going to say no JavaScript web framework. Okay, and this is going to run away, and it's literally going to create thousands of files on my local system around this project. I haven't delved into all of those to understand why there's so many there. We will go through some of the key ones and get an understanding of where do we actually go to work with this when this is done. Okay, so I'm going to leave that running. It's going to take a few minutes to run through there. What I need to do after that is run gulp, which is what's going to fire up Node and get my development environment running. So I do a gulp space serve, and that will run my local development environment. So I actually have another command prompt window open here. So I'd already built a hello web part. I knew it was going to take a little while for UML to scaffold that one up. So I said, okay, well, let's keep one ready to go here. So if I just type in gulp serve, going to fire this pre-created one that I have up in. It's the exact same one. I haven't really modified the code at all. So from that point of view, there's no smoke and mirrors happening from that point of view. We can go back to the one I'm just creating afterwards to have a look at that if we have time.
Peter, I'll just interrupt you here. Are you able to increase the font size at all in the command window?
All I can do is zoom in on that. So I'll try and do that more as I'm working in these windows so you can get a better look at what's coming through there. Yeah, because I imagine over the screen sharing that's pretty hard to read.
Yeah, that's.
How is that at this point here?
Quite a bit better, thank you.
Okay, so sorry, I'll try and remember to do that as I'm typing in anything through there, so that'll make it easier for everyone to see. Okay, so Gulp now has Node running with the local instance of that web part, and what it's done is it's fired up a page on my browser. So you can see I'm actually doing this webinar from home today, so I'm on my Peter-home machine. It's got a 4321 port that it's assigned to this. It's showing a warning or error from an SSL point of view. It's serving the site up on SSL, but I don't have certificates for Peter-home installed on my local machine. So first time I fired this up, I got a warning from Chrome saying, hey, this is not a trusted site, you shouldn't proceed. I hit the advanced, go past that, and it's happy to go from there. I don't recommend doing that in general when you're visiting SSL websites, but if it's your own development site, you should be able to trust your own work from that point of view. And I now have open what's called the SharePoint Workbench on my site. So what I can do here, this is kind of what the modern pages, if you've seen that at all in any of the recent sessions from Microsoft, interface looks like. You know, I have the ability to add content and web parts to a flowing page through here. It's not a fully interactive SharePoint. I have, you know, an app launcher control and an Office 365 icon up here. They're really just placeholders. They don't actually do anything because I'm not actually running in SharePoint at this point in time. But what I can do is I can hit the plus here and say, okay, let's pull up the web parts that I have in my local system. So I'll show you the files in a minute. There's a manifest that explains the local node running and what web parts it has available to this workbench. And it's seen that and says, oh, here's my hello web part world, hello world web part that I just created. So I can actually click on that and create an instance of this web part. You know, it doesn't do very much. It displays some text on here. Some of that text is configurable. I'll show you in a second. It's got a Learn More button, which just takes us over to the wiki pages from there. So I've actually left my app. I'll come back here to pull that back up again. So what can we do with this web part? Well, one of the key pieces with SharePoint Framework is to be able to configure the parts that we're placing onto pages. For people that have been doing client-side development using script editor web part or content editor web part, this has always been a challenge. You can drop your code into that script editor web part and have it rendered on the page, but if you want to drop that in a dozen different pages on your site and configure it differently on each one, you kind of had to build a fair bit of scaffolding to make that work for you because there was no configuration panel around that. In the SharePoint Framework, we do get that. So I get the pencil icon here, I can click on that, and I can pull up my editor panel or pane for the web part, which in this case just has one thing defined on it. There's the nice thing with the framework, and I'll show you in a minute, is we can code this pane here as well. So we can get fairly sophisticated in terms of how we want the web part to be configured. You know, is it text fields? Is it choice buttons, radio buttons, drop downs that we want to put in there? What sort of interaction between those fields do we want to put in there? Do we want to wire them into lookups or backend systems or REST calls? You know, we can do all those sorts of things through here because we're coding up that pane through the framework as well as the web part itself. So if I zoom back out for a second here, one of the things that we can do is make this a live update. So you can see as I'm typing on the side here, those changes are coming through right on the web part. I can define that as a property of the SharePoint Framework web part, whether I want this to be it's called a real-time update, or whether I want a more traditional apply button here that I do my changes, apply it, then the web part updates its presentation from there. And this all gets stored and instantiated into the properties of the web part. So when I save this page, I open this page up again later, that configuration is all there on that particular instance of the web part. So that's cool from an interaction point of view. How does the development happen behind the scenes there? So if I flip over to my Visual Studio Code window here, so those of you who haven't seen code before, it's a really stripped down version of Visual Studio. There's no TFS integration, there's no solution files or project files. It's really pointed at a folder on your file system, and it'll just open up the structure of all those files and let you edit and work with that. So let me actually start by just saying, okay, I want to open folder here. You know, I can point it to my development, to my Hello Web Part, or Hello World web part folder that I created, select that folder, and boom, I've got the whole structure of my file system here. I'm actually keen on this not just for SharePoint Framework, but we actually do the same sort of approach when we're doing the branding for SharePoint. You know, we keep a folder structure on a local file system with all the master pages, page layout, CSS, JavaScript, everything we need for branding and deployment of a SharePoint application. We check all that into TFS, so we've got it from a source control point of view, and then we deploy it out into SharePoint. One of the cool things that I'm starting to learn through here is Gulp would be great for that too, to say, well, you know, if I just want to change the master page or the CSS file for my SharePoint site, I can do the same sort of structure. I can have Gulp running in the background. When I save that change, it grabs the local copy, pushes it up into SharePoint. I can refresh my change and see the change right from there. You know, because to be honest, what we tend to do is do our work locally in SharePoint so we can refresh and quickly iterate through that. We don't always remember to bring those things back into our local TFS repository, which means our source control gets out of sync there. Doing it through Gulp with this kind of approach would eliminate that, make it much more solid from a development point of view. Okay, so I've got my file structure open here, so I can see some of the different components in here. And I'm down in this SRC tree under web parts, and that's really the main area that I've been working with in terms of what are the files related to this particular web part that I'm going to be interested in. So there's a couple that I want to draw attention to. There's a hello webparts.ts. So TS is the suffix for TypeScript. So these are all TypeScript files, which ultimately Gulp will compile into JavaScript files, which is what gets served up on the end user pages. So you're not directly editing the JavaScript, you're editing the TypeScript files. And you can see, you know, the imports and the classes that we have in that TypeScript file. It's much closer to a C# style of coding than it is to a JavaScript, even though at the end of the day, what results coming out of it is actual plain old JavaScript files. Below that, there's a .manifest.json. JSON JavaScript object notation is a standard way of putting data into a file. This manifest file is what explains to SharePoint what web parts are in this project. So it explores that manifest to say, hey, you know, what can I put up in that gallery when I clicked the Add Web Part button? And then the web part props.ts, that's another TypeScript file that defines the editor pane on the right-hand side. What are the properties of the web part that I can work with? So let's come over on the right side here. I'm looking at the hello webparts.ts file right now. So we can see a number of imports, constructs, and ultimately there's a render method in here that's used to render the HTML that's going to go onto the site. And it's just a standard HTML set of div classes in there. We can see some $ placeholders. If you're familiar with handlebars from a templating point of view, it's kind of that same sort of idea where it's going to take properties from the web part itself and embed them in the HTML of the rendered web part itself. So let's zoom back out so I can edit for a second. Let's do something simple, like I'm just going to take one of these paragraph tags here, and I'm going to duplicate it a couple of times through there. Now if I come over to my gulp window for a second, let me zoom in on that. I think I took too long to do it, but basically it saw that change that I did, and it compiled what was required just for that particular change to that one TypeScript file. So it's not like it rebuilds the whole project. It figures out what's been modified in here based on its rules and builds what's required from there. So now if I come over to my browser page, let me just refresh that page, and that didn't work for me. Oh, let's see here. What did I do wrong? I think I didn't actually hit save. That would certainly help. So now we see our gulp window going. So it actually ran quickly through there. So you saw it only took a couple seconds at the most to go through that process of rebuilding that. And now I can come over to my workbench, refresh it, and I can now see 3 copies of that paragraph tag there. Not a very exciting demo of what can I do from a coding point of view, but it gives you a sense of how quickly I can go through iterations. Go into code, make a quick code change in there. Don't even need to touch the gulp window, it just does that automatically. Come back to my browser, refresh my browser page, and boom, I've got it there. I've still got the configuration that I set in there for the web part. I can go ahead and update that, put something a little nicer looking in there, and away you go from there. So it becomes a very quick pass through from a development iteration perspective. So it's fantastic from that point of view. Okay, so that's kind of as far as I want to go from a live code demo point of view, because I want to save some time here. We've only got about 15 minutes left to take you through some of the other questions and scenarios that we come up with. So as I mentioned, in the client-side code, you can only do what the user has permissions to do. And I'll give you some examples later why that doesn't work. There are scenarios where users shouldn't have rights to do something directly in SharePoint, but through the context of the application, they do need to do that. Things like maybe I want to implement column level security. There's certain columns on a SharePoint list that I want somebody to be able to edit, and other ones maybe I don't even want them to see. I can't do that out of the box with SharePoint. I can't set that kind of permission level. But I can do that if I can run with elevated permissions. Say I'm not going to give the user access to that SharePoint list directly, but through my API, through my app, they will be able to do what they need to do through there. So any sort of custom business rules, JavaScript, in my opinion, is not a place to put strong and tight business rules. Like if you say, okay, we're doing a leave request form and you have 10 days of vacation remaining, we have a rule that says you can't exceed that. You put that in JavaScript, somebody that's smart could hit F12, go into the developer toolbar and just skip past that line of code and book themselves off for a month. JavaScript is not a good place to put those sort of secure business rules that you want to make rock solid. That should really happen somewhere on a server. It's not going to happen on the SharePoint server. We're not going to run any of our code there, remember, but we can have somewhere else to do that. Having said that, though, there are a lot of scenarios where client-side only does make a lot of sense. If we just want to present some read-only data, things like catalog publishing and visualizations or some sort of custom UI for that, client-side can make a lot of sense. Even simple forms where the user has access to the list behind it, but the form just presents them a friendlier way to interact with that. And maybe you run some workflows behind the scenes, and I'll show you an example of that, where once they've submitted to that list, we just take that item out. So we can still apply some level of security through that. So if we're going to do that, we're going to work through the SharePoint APIs. And there's a couple of ways to do that. We can use the client-side object model. So Microsoft has standard methods for .NET and for JavaScript to access SharePoint through client-side code. Or there's the REST APIs. And REST really seems to be the preferred path Microsoft's investing in. There's always been this back and forth of what's in one model versus the other. REST seems to be the one where most of the investment is going into. So let me show you a couple examples. I'll take you through here and then through some live demonstrations to give you a sense of that. The first is our Shakespeare reference project. So those of you who haven't been on one of my past webinars, I refer to this a lot. It's an open source project that we publish up on our website of how to do not just client-side development, but how do you do branding, package it all up, deploy it out, PowerShell scripts, and we make all of those scripts and all the source code and everything available as part of that. So if I flip over to my browser here, and which one do we have it on? There we go. You can actually go to this shakespearedev.envisionit.com URL yourself. It's anonymously available. It's running on a SharePoint 2013 farm. So it's not in the cloud. It's an on-premises approach. But things like this slider is actually a Nevo control. It's an open source control for slider. We've got roll-ups of news and media here. Those are all done through client-side code. Now, they're not built with the SharePoint framework because it's not ready for on-premise just yet. But the approach that we've taken through here is going to make it very easy for us to lift this and put it into SharePoint Framework. And we're keen to do that and use that on client projects, particularly SharePoint Online. You know, if we're building intranets, roll-ups is a big part of that. You know, having a home page news or events roll-up, building that with a SharePoint Framework just makes a ton of sense. Behind the scenes, how this is working is basically we have a little HTML snippet, which, surprise, surprise, we use the script editor web part to drop that piece of HTML onto the page here. And then we've got some jQuery in the background that looks for that HTML. See the tag in it says, oh, that's one of these special web parts. I need to go do a query back to SharePoint, get some data, template it, and bring it back up onto the system. Now, we can actually see this. I've turned on some of the debugging features here, so we can actually see behind the scenes how that's working. So if I click this debug link here, it'll take us to this REST search page. And basically, the template has said, this is a query that I need you to execute back against the search API on SharePoint. So it's a standard out of the box. This isn't an API that we built. It comes from Microsoft. And I actually execute that query, and I can see what comes back. You know, it's saying, go to this particular list, the news list, go get me these properties back that I need to present it. Only get me 3 because this is the home page, and sort it in date descending order from the article start date. You can get quite sophisticated in your queries against this particular example of one of the REST API endpoints. And we just used a Kendo grid to make it a little more presentable of the data that's coming back from there. So I can see, okay, it only took 281 milliseconds to execute that, and here's my 3 rows of data, which ultimately become what I see on the home page here. We use handlebars to template that, so there's actually just a couple of lines of HTML in the template. It takes what comes back from the API in the template, mashes it together, and gives me nice friendly HTML out from that. I don't have time to go into the details on that. Past sessions have covered that, but it's a pretty cool way of doing roll-ups rather than using the content search web part, which introduces a lot more complexity. We do the same thing on our Envision IT site. If you've come to our events or news pages, you know, the registration for this webinar itself, this roll-up has been done in the same way. So these are examples where we'd want to drop a SharePoint Framework web part on to insert this into a page. And particularly on Extranet, where you maybe want to have news or events in lots of different areas of the site, Framework makes a lot of sense. You could then configure it to say, I'm dropping this in the HR section, and I only want to target HR news on this web part. You know, you can make the configuration do that. It's very easy for a power user to then drop those web parts onto their pages from there. Even if we want to do something more sophisticated, like our case study section, you know, this ability to flip through different case studies, this again is just using the REST search API, knockout, and a little bit of jQuery to really dress up the user experience through there. And this whole thing is a script editor web part right now, again, could be embedded into the SharePoint framework, which would let us do some cool things. We're actually working on a new version of the Envision IT website, like have different case study sections in different solution areas of our site. You know, and again, we would configure that web part to say, hey, if we're on public websites, then only show me the public website case studies. So you can start to see where some of the possibilities are and where things can go from there. So we talked about that. I didn't mention, I mean, we actually use cross-site publishing to render those events not only up on the Envision IC site, but also on the Extranet User Manager site. The custom user experience. Now let's go into more simple forms where we actually have named users and we want to provide a better user experience into SharePoint from a forms point of view. So this is a portal that we built on premises in SharePoint 2013 for the Pentecostal Assembly of Canada. So about 1,500 current and retired clergy and staff that need to come into this pension portal. And there was a number of forms that we needed to put up in this. One was, or two actually, were for address and banking information updates that just write to SharePoint lists. And the third one was a pension calculator that was a little more complicated. So let me actually take you into the portal and give you a sense of what that looks like. This is a bilingual portal, so we're in Canada here. We need to support English and French. So I'll go down in the English. My French is not that good. Now this is a dev version of the site that we're coming up, so there's not a lot of content in it. We've used that same roll-up approach that I was showing on the previous sites to do the announcements. We just don't have any in our dev site right now. What I want to do though is come down into my pension member section here and come into the address update form. So here we have, again, a script editor web part that drops a piece of HTML on the page, and there's some jQuery behind that says, oh, I see that HTML, I need to light up some functionality for that. First thing it does is says, go figure out who the current signed-in user is. So I'm Peter Carson, my ID is my domain/username, and then I need to fill in all my remaining information through here. So we've got different styles of controls. I can put a date picker in through there. I can just drop some different field values in. We've made these all required for the most part. The last two are optional. I'll leave those out and go ahead and submit that. And before I do that, I just want to flip this over. Imagine I'm on my smartphone. I've pulled my browser size down. We can see that the form has responded to that change. It stacked the captions up above the fields and provide me a nice vertically scrolling form that's going to work well on a smartphone. As I pull that out, we're going to see that expand and respond to those different browser sizes from there. So that's all done using Bootstrap as a responsive CSS framework. I'll go ahead and submit this. It says, okay, it's submitted. And what I can do is actually under the hood, going into my site, I can see here's my address update modified 1 minute ago because that form submitted into this list. So we can see here is my address update. It's showing in progress. We actually have a workflow process behind this that picks it up to say, okay, who needs to do what with this and work it through from there. But the idea is that that front-end code that came to render this form actually didn't have the whole form designed in there. It's built in a way that it actually queries the list that it's pointed to, and it dynamically renders the form fields based on the configuration of the list. So if I want to create another form, like let's go to the banking information update, I actually don't need to code the whole form up. All I need to do is create another list with a different set of fields in it, point this script editor web part against that, and boom, I've got my new form there. Now, because we don't have a configuration panel, we can't go through actually defining which list to point to. This is a great example of where SharePoint Framework would work well from there. I better pick my pace up because I'm about to run out of time. We've got a couple more examples in here that I won't get a chance to go through here, but I do want to spend a minute just on this elevated permissions idea. This is an important concept, that there's some code that you just don't want to run in JavaScript in the browser. You can't do it on the SharePoint server. You need somewhere else for that. And that's where Visual Studio Web APIs come in. So we fire up a full Visual Studio project. So this isn't code. This is the regular version of Visual Studio. And we can actually build a back-end API to that. I mean, we've done that with an example here for my wife's actually a student librarian in a local high school. If we go over to her site here, we've got a resources request form that can actually be filled out anonymously. And we've got some email workflows around that that make sure that the proper things are being done, and the form can get filled out through there. Behind the scenes, it's calling a web API that basically elevates the permissions from the anonymous user that can't write to the SharePoint list to a service account that can do that. We've actually done the same thing on the College of Early Childhood Educators site. If I flip over to their site for a second here, we can actually pull up, this is a mandatory employer report. So this is their live public-facing site, hosted on SharePoint 2013. We've got a very long form, a lot of interactions through here, repeating sections, things like that, around incidents related to early childhood educators that need to be recorded back to the college. Maybe police are involved, documents need to get uploaded and tagged to that and get submitted. When I hit submit here, it's going to fire up that back-end API and actually create a whole package. It creates a document set in their SharePoint intranet, actually, in a whole different SharePoint site. All the attachments go in there. It generates a PDF and a Word version of this form submission itself, makes it part of the document set, and starts a whole workflow process from there. So it's a fairly sophisticated application, all fired off of a client-side script. So this was all written using standard HTML, jQuery, and such from there, and then submitting that back into the back-end web API. Authentication is a tricky piece around the Web API. I'd refer you back to the slides, which we're going to post later. There was a number of scenarios I kind of skipped across on that. One being anonymous, another being using SharePoint authentication or Windows authentication. If you're in the online world, you're probably going to want to do something like Windows Azure AD, which is how people sign into Office 365. You can actually set up the authentication to your application in your Web API so it can actually inherit the credentials of the user from SharePoint Online and pass those through to your backend Web API. You can then do things in the context of that user, or you can make decisions based on that, who that user is, and work through from there. An example of this is a leave request application we've built for ourselves as well as a number of our clients. So I've got a couple forms up here. This is the standard Envision IT one. A good example here where we need to be able to reach back into SharePoint lists to figure out, what is somebody's available vacation days. Apparently I've demoed this too many times, I'm in the hole. We don't want broad visibility to that list. We need some very specific rules that we can't easily implement through SharePoint permissions, so we bake that into the API. In another case, we've got one for the County of Simcoe that was based off of this. A lot of those rules go back to their SAP systems. We're actually integrating in third-party systems there. So you can start to build quite sophisticated applications through there. Okay, I don't want to go too much beyond the noon hour that we're already at, but I do have a couple of key slides that I want to draw your attention to and encourage you to come back to later. This was a great slide from Microsoft last week that talked about all the different platforms available, SharePoint Framework just being part of that, which are new, which are in preview, which are on premises only. So it's a great overview from that point of view. I mentioned an announcement last week around content delivery networks. So this is a new feature that you can light up in your tenant, where basically you run some PowerShell against your tenant. Once you've done that, static assets that you would typically put into your master page gallery, you still do that, but behind the scenes what SharePoint does is it pushes them out into an Azure content delivery network. You don't need to set up that for yourself. Microsoft does it automatically, and then you reference the CDN. Really helps from a performance point of view because those assets come from the CDN rather than from SharePoint. So things like your CSS, your master page images, things like that, you can really improve the performance of your site as a whole by leveraging those. So I'm pretty keen on where they're going with this particular approach. These are the Ignite framework sessions that I mentioned that I drew a lot of the content from. Again, the decks and the videos for those are up and available. And then the last thing to mention, one of the other sessions was around SharePoint patterns and practices. SharePoint PnP is an awesome resource. They've got a lot of stuff for general SharePoint development. It's also the go-to place for samples and any reusable components around SharePoint Framework as well. So it's a great resource to have a look at. It's widely used, very common from that point of view. Again, got a bunch of links in there. So I'm at 12:02 now. I should probably cut it at that point. Amanda, I'm not sure if there's any questions that you want me to answer during the session now, or whether we just want to follow up with those afterwards.
We can follow up with them afterwards. I don't have any outstanding ones.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining. Apologies on the rapid fire towards the end there. I've got to work on my pacing here a bit, but a ton of great content. Really excited about where Microsoft's going with the SharePoint framework. So I encourage you to check out the links. Look for the deck and the recording up on our site tomorrow. We'll send a follow-up email as well, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.